The stars had never forgotten. That was the thing about space. Calder Voss had learned, it didn't forget anything. Every photon that ever left a dying sun was still out there, still moving, carrying its message at the speed of light toward whatever might be patient enough to receive it. Every sound ever made on a world with an atmosphere had pressed itself into the rock, into the sediment, the reverberations decaying but never fully vanishing. The universe was a ledger, and nothing was ever truly erased from it. The math didn't allow it. Entropy scattered things, yes, but it didn't erase them. It only made them harder to read. He'd been 8 years old when she said it. He remembered the way the Velhari light changed at dusk. It didn't fade the way Earth's sunsets did, didn't bleed through orange to red to the familiar warm dark. It shifted in spectrum entirely, moving from a pale white gold into something the human eye had no real name for, a color that sat between ultraviolet and deep violet in a register human vision could only barely catch at its edges, only in the peripheral blur, the way you can sometimes see a dim star better by looking slightly away from it. The settlers had called it the bluing hour. The Velhari themselves had a word for it, Sail asterisk, a word that meant, roughly, the color that promises. He hadn't understood that translation until much later. They'd been sitting on the ridge above Settlement 4, the two of them, which was technically forbidden on 3 different counts. He wasn't supposed to leave the habitat perimeter after the 3rd bell. She wasn't supposed to be interacting with human children without her court escort, and neither of them was supposed to be anywhere near the ridge because the soil there was unstable, and the geologists had flagged it with orange tape that both of them had ducked under without hesitation or apparent guilt. Her name was Sariel Veth Kavan. She was a Velhari princess, the 3rd daughter of High Empress Ith Kavan, whose domain covered 4 inhabited star systems and whose court occupied an orbital palace so large it generated its own gravitational anomaly and had its own designation on star charts. The palace, Calder had learned from his parents' briefings, was older than the oldest human civilization. It had been expanded by 17 successive empresses, each one adding her architectural signature to the structure, until it had become less a building than an argument about time. Sariel was not supposed to be sitting on a flagged ridge with a human boy. She was supposed to be in her formal linguistic immersion program, learning trade standard from approved tutors in a sealed and monitored room with filtered air and regulated temperature, and no orange tape to duck under. She was 7 years old, by the Velhari count, which put her biological development at roughly equivalent to an 8-year-old human. Her skin was the color of deep water, a rich, dark navy that shifted to indigo at her cheekbones when the light hit it right, and at the very tips of her fingers had a quality almost like the iridescence of a peacock feather, a structural color that moved with the angle of observation. Her hair was silver white, fine as spider silk, and it moved in the Velhari wind with a weight and drift that didn't quite obey the same physics as human hair, slower to respond, more deliberate in its settling, as if it were consulting with the air rather than simply yielding to it. Her eyes were gold. Not amber, not hazel, not the warm brown that humans sometimes called golden, gold, like fresh-poured metal that hadn't cooled yet, with vertical pupils that caught the bluing hour light and split it into something that made Calder's breath go short in a way he didn't have words for at 8 and still didn't have entirely adequate words for at 29. She had 2 sets of eyelids, the outer pair which were normal enough, and a secondary inner set, translucent and slightly iridescent, that slid across horizontally when she was thinking hard or startled or deeply attentive. She'd startled when he'd first spoken to her. He'd come over the ridge without seeing her there, and she'd been sitting with her knees drawn up and her secondary eyelids had flickered rapidly, a startled reflex that she'd immediately controlled. He'd said, "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," and she had stared at him for a long moment with those gold eyes and then said, very carefully, in accented but perfectly grammatical trade standard, "You did not scare me. I was simply recalibrating." He'd laughed. He hadn't meant to. It had just come out. She'd looked at him with an expression he couldn't read, and then she'd said, "That sound, what is that?" "Laughing," he'd said. "I know what laughing is," she'd said, with the precise dignity of a child who has studied something academically and is offended at the implication that she hasn't. I wanted to understand why. "Because what you said was funny." "I was being accurate." "I know that's what was funny." She had thought about this for a very long time, long enough that he'd sat down beside her, because it seemed rude to stand over someone who was thinking. Then she'd said, "Humans are strange," but she didn't say it the way the Velhari adults said it, with a tight contraction around the word *strange that implied unwanted, threatening lesser. She said it the way a person says something they find genuinely interesting, like, "I hadn't expected to find this here, but I'm glad I did." That had been the beginning of it. They'd met at the Ridge 4 more times over the next 3 weeks, always at the bluing hour, always when both their respective handlers were occupied elsewhere. He taught her to skip stones badly, because the Velhari Ridge didn't have the right kind of flat stones, so they'd used hexagonal shale chips that tumbled more than skipped, arcing and spinning into the shallow basin below in a way that was more comedy than art. She'd not laughed at this, but she'd watched with that quality of intense attention, and on her third try, one of the chips had actually bounced twice before sinking, and she'd made a sound he couldn't describe, not quite a laugh, but something adjacent to triumph. She taught him 3 Velhari constellation names and the myths that went with them, translating carefully, choosing her words with a precision that made him feel, even at 8 years old, that she was giving him something she didn't give many people. The first constellation was called the Keeper, and its myth involved a guardian who had refused to leave their post even when the war ended, who had stood watch so long they'd become part of the sky. The second was the Unfinished Argument, 2 stars that had been moving toward each other for 1 billion years and had not yet met. The third constellation had a name she'd struggled to translate, something like the color the eye remembers after the light is gone. A constellation you could only really see properly during the bluing hour, visible only in that strange peripheral vision register, where the eye caught what ordinary-looking couldn't. On the last evening before her court was scheduled to depart, they'd sat on the ridge and watched the bluing hour come. The sky had gone that nameless color, the one without a human name, the one that wasn't ultraviolet and wasn't violet but somehow participated in both. Neither of them had spoken for a while. Below them, Settlement 4 made its small, busy sounds. The clank of habitat equipment, a dog barking at something in the middle distance, the hiss of an atmospheric processor cycling. Then she'd said, very quietly without looking away from the sky, "When I grow up, I'll marry you." He'd looked at her. She'd been looking at the sky, her secondary eyelids half drawn, her silver hair lifting in the wind. "Why?" he'd said. "Because you laughed," she'd said. "Because you showed me the not quite skipping stones. Because you are the first person who has listened to me without watching the door to see if someone important was coming." She'd paused. "And because you are the first human I have met, and I think humans must be like you, and if they are, then we should be bonded. Because it seems wasteful not to be." He'd been 8, he hadn't known what to say. He'd said, "Okay." She'd turned to look at him then, and the gold eyes had been very serious, and she'd said, "The *Sail* is a witness. When a Velhari makes a vow at the bluing hour, the light carries it. The stars keep it. It is not informal." He'd nodded, because it seemed like the right thing to do. "You understand?" she'd pressed. "I understand," he'd said, and he'd meant it in the way 8-year-olds mean things completely, without the complications of consequence. The next morning, her court had lifted off, and he'd watched the orbital ship diminish into the white sky until it was gone. He'd gone home and eaten breakfast and told his mother there had been a Velhari girl at the Ridge and she'd made him learn constellation names. His mother had looked at him with an expression he hadn't understood at the time and said, "Was she kind?" He'd thought about it and said yes. His mother had said, "Good, that's what matters." He'd been 8 years old. He was 29 now. The summons had come through official channels, which was how he knew it was serious. Calder was a structural engineer for the Interstellar Settlement Authority, not a glamorous title, not a dangerous posting, not the kind of career that attracted attention from the Velhari Imperial Court. He fixed things. Habitats cracked under tectonic stress nobody had properly modeled. Atmospheric processors seized in conditions the manufacturers hadn't anticipated. Foundational pylons sank into soil that had looked stable on the survey and wasn't stable in practice. He went where the problems were, assessed them, built plans, and either fixed them himself or supervised the teams that did. He was good at it. He was methodical, unimpressed by what was supposed to be impressive, and he had a particular gift for looking at a broken system and understanding not just what had failed, but why it had wanted to fail. What the system had been telling people for months before the failure that they hadn't been reading correctly. He had been on 3 different postings in the last year. He was the kind of person who never quite had a fixed address, who kept a small bag perpetually half-packed, who'd learned to maintain relationships over long distances or let them lapse. He wasn't unhappy about this. He was good at his work. The work took him to interesting places. If he sometimes had the feeling of a person who'd been moving for so long that the possibility of stopping had started to feel theoretical, that wasn't something he'd have said out loud. He was on Drenna's station, elbow-deep in a coolant relay that had been misfiring for 6 weeks, and had already been misdiagnosed by 2 previous engineers who treated the symptom and not the cause, when his comm unit buzzed with a Priority 1 message bearing the imperial seal of the Velhari Empress. He read it twice. Then he wiped coolant off his hands, sat down on the floor of the relay corridor with his back against the wall, and read it a 3rd time. The message was brief, formal, and almost entirely devoid of context. It informed him that his presence was requested, not ordered, which was interesting, given who was doing the requesting, at the Velhari Imperial Diplomatic Vessel sail Kavan * at his earliest possible convenience, at which time a formal matter of record would be addressed with his assistance. It bore 2 seals. The outer seal of the Empress's court, a complex interlocking pattern that he recognized from diplomatic documents he'd seen in briefing rooms, and an inner seal he didn't recognize, a smaller mark in indigo ink, simpler than the outer seal, with a quality of personal rather than official origin. He stared at the inner seal for a long moment. It was a small star with a line through it. In Velhari notation, which he'd picked up a basic working knowledge of over the years, a star with a line through it indicated something witnessed and recorded, something that had been seen and was not forgotten. Then he calmed his supervisor, told him the coolant relay fix would have to wait, and filed an emergency leave request that he was fairly certain would be approved, given that refusing the Velhari Empress's invitation, however politely it had been phrased, was not a thing the settlement authority wanted on its record. It was approved in 11 minutes. The * sail Kavan * was parked in low orbit above Drenna's. He took a shuttle up that same afternoon, still with coolant residue under his fingernails that he hadn't quite gotten all of. On the shuttle, alone in the small passenger compartment, he'd laughed. He hadn't planned to. It had just come out. The Velhari didn't build ships the way humans did. Human ship design was fundamentally industrial, functional first, aesthetic second, a series of compromises between what engineering demanded and what the people living inside could tolerate over long transit times. Every design choice in a human ship answered a question about efficiency. How to move the maximum number of people or goods across the maximum distance with the minimum expenditure of resources. The aesthetics that ended up in human ships were the aesthetics that survived the efficiency constraints, not decoration, but the residue of function that happened to be beautiful. Velhari ships were the opposite. They were built the way their architects built everything, from the inside out, starting with the spaces where people would breathe and think and feel and work, and then constructing the mechanical realities around those spaces as secondary concerns. The engineering was still rigorous. Velhari engineering was not casual, but it was in service to the interior rather than the other way around. The result was a ship that felt, from the inside, like moving through a living thing. The corridors curved. Not dramatically, not in a way that impeded movement, but in the gentle way of a body rather than the straight-line way of a machine. The lighting was not fixed. It shifted in hue and intensity by the hour, following the Velhari light cycle that their biology still tracked even in the permanent artificial environment of a spacecraft, the same way human bodies track circadian rhythms even in windowless rooms. The floors were not perfectly flat but subtly contoured underfoot, a gentle topography that guided movement without forcing it, that made you aware of your body in a way flat floors didn't. Everything smelled faintly of something he'd never been able to name on any of his previous encounters with Velhari spaces. Not incense, not ionized air, not any chemical compound he could identify. Just the Velhari smell, which his brain had filed at age 8 under the category *safe and had never revised. A court official met him at the airlock. The official was tall, cobalt blue, with a formal collar that indicated mid-level court status, and she regarded him with the particular careful blankness that Velhari diplomats adopted around humans when they hadn't yet decided which category to put them in. Threatening, irrelevant, interesting, or complicated. Those were the Velhari's 4 general categories for unexpected humans, as near as Calder had been able to determine over the years. The blankness meant she was still assessing. "Calder Voss," she said. "That's me," he said. "Her Imperial Highness Princess Sariel Veth Kavan will receive you in the observatory," the official said, and turned without further explanation and walked. He followed, hands in his pockets, watching the ship as he moved through it. The corridors here were hung with thin fabric panels in deep blue and violet, patterned with what looked like written text in the Velhari formal script, not decoration, he suspected, but record. The Velhari wrote their histories on everything. Walls, clothing, the walls of ships. The idea was that the record should surround you, that living inside a written account of where you'd come from was the correct posture for a person navigating where to go. He thought about that as he walked. The stars outside held their positions. The ship moved through them steadily, carrying its history on its walls. The observatory was at the forward crown of the ship, a room with a ceiling that was entirely transparent, open to the stars. No glass that he could identify, just the stars, and the soft blue-black of space, and the distant silver curve of Drenas below, its upper atmospheric band caught in sunlight and glowing white gold. The ship's environmental shielding held the vacuum out, invisible and absolute, and the effect was of standing directly under an open sky, except that the sky went all the way around. Standing at the center of the room, looking up, was a woman. She was tall, taller than he remembered, but that was the nature of growing up. He'd been measuring against himself at 8, and the proportions had shifted. The navy skin had deepened, if anything, richer and more complex in its range of tone than the child he'd known. When the starlight caught her at certain angles, she had an undertone that was almost bioluminescent, a subtle internal quality that produced the impression of light coming from within rather than simply being reflected. Her hair was the same silver white, still fine, still moving with that independent gravity, gathered at the back of her head in an arrangement that suggested formality without quite achieving severity. She was wearing a garment that was clearly court formal, layered silk in deep indigo and something stiffer underneath, close to armor in its fitted structure. But she'd removed the outer ceremonial pieces and set them on a low table near the door, and what she was standing in now had the quality of something worn close to the person, something she'd chosen rather than required. She heard him come in. He knew she heard him because the secondary eyelids flickered, visible even from across the room, before she turned. The gold eyes found him. He had known intellectually that she would be grown. He had known intellectually that this summons was connected to a conversation he'd half believed he'd imagined, the way adults often half believe the serious things children said, filing them under asterisk childhood, not binding, moved on. He had known, intellectually, that he was walking into something he didn't fully understand the shape of. None of that had quite prepared him for her face. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, in trade standard that had lost all of its accent, that was cleaner than most diplomats he'd ever met, "You're shorter than I expected." He blinked. "What?" "I had formed a memory of you as quite tall," she said. "I think I must have been measuring against my own height at the time, which was not significant. You are, in fact, average height for a human male." "I'm 5'11", he said reflexively. "Yes," she said, "average." He stared at her. Then, despite everything, the formal ship, the official who'd escorted him in silence, the imperial seal on the message that had turned his whole afternoon inside out, he laughed. It came out exactly the same as it had when he was 8. He couldn't have helped it. She went very still. Her secondary eyelids drew fully back, which he now knew, with the accumulated knowledge of a decade of working in Velhari-adjacent territories and learning to read what he could of their body language, meant acute attention, the maximum aperture of attention, the full opening. She watched him laugh with those fully open gold eyes, and something happened in her expression. Not quite a smile. Not yet. Something preparatory for a smile. A change around the corners of her mouth that might be the early movement of something larger. "That sound," she said. "I know," he said, getting himself back under control. Still laughing, still the same reason. "Because I was accurate." "Because you were accurate," he agreed. She studied him for another moment. Then she crossed the room, unhurried, that particular Velhari gait that was neither slow nor fast but covered distance with a quality of absolute intention, the way water moves toward the lowest point, and stopped 3 feet from him. Up close, she was more than her eyes and her height. There were fine silver markings at her temples, delicate as lines drawn in breath on cold glass, that he hadn't been able to see from across the room, Velhari coming-of-age marks, inscribed in a ritual he knew existed but whose details he'd never been taught. Earned rather than given, he'd read somewhere. A record written on the person rather than on the wall. Her hands, clasped in front of her, had 4 fingers each, slightly longer than human proportion, the fingertips tapering to nails the color of polished obsidian. Up close, the internal light quality of her skin was more apparent, not glowing exactly, but as if there was something warm a few layers down that the surface skin was translating imperfectly. "I was not certain you would come," she said. "I almost didn't understand the message," he said. "Your official correspondence is very formal." "It needed to be formal," she said, "because it is a formal matter." She paused. "I am being considered for the Velhari High Council's next diplomatic seat. The nomination requires, as a precondition, that I formalize any outstanding vow made in the presence of *sale*. Outstanding vows are considered pending obligations. Unresolved ones create instability in a counselor's record. The record keepers are thorough." He looked at her. "You're here because of a bureaucratic requirement." She met his gaze without flinching or explaining. "I am here because 21 years ago I made a vow at the bluing hour to a human boy on a flagged ridge above Settlement 4, and the stars witnessed it, and the Velhari record-keepers do not let such things go unremarked. The bureaucratic requirement and my own reasons are not the same thing. And if I'd said no to the summons, then I would have had to explain to the record-keepers that the vow was voided by non-response," she said. "Which would have been accurate and entirely correct, and would also have been—" She stopped. "Would have been what?" he said. She looked at him steadily. The secondary eyelid stayed fully open. "A loss," she said simply, and there was nothing else in the word, no cushion or qualification around it. The observatory was quiet. Below them, Drenna's turned its slow half-arc. The stars didn't move, or seemed not to, the way very large and distant things seem motionless while actually traveling at unimaginable speed. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "Did you mean it when you were 7? She considered this with the precision he remembered from the ridge. The same way she'd considered what laughing meant. The same care applied to the same kind of question. The same willingness to sit inside the question long enough to understand it before answering. "I meant the intention of it," she said at last. "I meant, this person is worth keeping. I meant, the universe is very large and I have met very few things in it that I wanted to hold on to, and I would like to hold on to this." She paused. "Whether that is the same as meaning the words exactly as spoken. I was 7. My vocabulary for what I was feeling was limited to the words I had, and the word I had was the word for a permanent bond between two people, and it was, I think, the most accurate word available to me at the time." "It's still a pretty big thing to say." "Yes," she agreed, "but it was a big feeling. I did not have a smaller word for it." He was quiet for a moment. The starlight came down on both of them, neutral, patient, coming from sources so old that the light was a message from something that might no longer exist in the form that sent it. "So what happens now?" he said. "Formally, what does formalizing a vow actually require?" "A meeting," she said. "An acknowledgement from both parties that the vow was made and is remembered. An agreement about what is to be done with it, whether it is honored, renegotiated, or mutually dissolved." "And you need that for the council nomination?" "Yes." "Okay," he said. "The vow was made and I remember it." He looked at her. "What do you want to do with it?" The gold eyes held his for a long moment. The secondary eyelid stayed fully open the whole time. "I would prefer not to dissolve it," she said. They gave him a cabin on the Sail Kavan asterisk. Apparently the formal process took 3 days minimum, because the Velhari didn't do anything significant in fewer than 3 days, a convention that had its roots in an old astronomical practice of waiting for the 3rd confirmed sighting before recording an observation as reliable. And he found himself living in a room that had been adjusted for human habitation, with a care that suggested someone had thought about it well in advance, and with good knowledge of what humans needed. The lighting in his cabin stayed closer to white than the rest of the ship. The bunk was calibrated to human standard length. There was a food processor that, when he tested it, offered him a menu that included actual human options alongside the Velhari standards, not approximations, not the compressed nutrition blocks that ISA stations typically offered when they were trying to cover dietary bases, but actual food, prepared from actual ingredients. Small adjustments, considered ones. The kind of adjustments that required specific information about a specific person's cultural and biological needs, not just general knowledge of human physiology. He suspected he knew who had provided that information. He ate dinner alone the first night, sitting by the porthole, watching Drenna's rotate below, its terminator line moving in that slow and stately procession that all planets made when you watch them from orbit. He turned the situation over in his head the way he turned structural problems over, looking at it from different angles, checking for where the load was being applied, trying to understand what the system was actually doing versus what it appeared to be doing. The structural explanation was simple enough. A Velhari princess needed to formalize a childhood vow for bureaucratic reasons related to a council nomination, and he was the other party in the vow, and you didn't say no when the Velhari Empress's court sent you a priority 1 message. That was the load-bearing structure of the situation. Clear, legible, rational. But underneath the load-bearing structure there was always the actual condition of the materials. And the actual condition of the materials was, she'd said, *A loss, asterisk, and she'd meant it, and she hadn't tried to soften it. And there were maps of human settlements in a workspace on this ship that had been maintained for years. And she had not looked up his name because finding him and doing nothing would have been too costly. He sat by the porthole and tried to be honest with himself in the way that fixing broken systems required you to be honest. Not about what you wished were true, but about what was actually there. What was actually, there was a woman who had been carrying something for 21 years and had finally found a formal mechanism to do something about it. And a man who had also been carrying something, less formally, less consciously, in the way you carry things you've never quite acknowledged. In the particular quality of attention he paid to news from Velhari space. In the way he'd stored the 3 constellation names longer than he'd stored anything else from that particular time of his life. In the inexplicable laugh that had come out of him when he'd read a formal diplomatic summons in a coolant relay corridor. He stayed at the porthole until Drenna's completed a half rotation. Then he went to bed. The second day she came to find him herself, which he gathered was not standard protocol. Court officials didn't come with her. She arrived alone at the corridor outside his cabin at the 7th hour, in something less formal than the previous day. Still Velhari and clearly not casual by any standard that would read as relaxed to an outsider, but without the outer armored ceremonial pieces, and with her silver hair loose rather than arranged. She looked at him with an expression that on a human face he'd have called resolute, the face of a person who has decided to do something that costs something and has made their peace with the cost. "I would like to show you something," she said. He followed her. She brought him to a different part of the ship, not the observatory, but a smaller room near the aft section, one that she opened with a personal code entered at a keypad that was set low on the wall, at Velhari's standing height. The room was a workspace, clearly hers, a Velhari desk made of something that looked like pale wood but wasn't, covered in data slates and physical maps, and several objects he couldn't identify that might have been instruments or might have been decorative, all organized in a way that made internal sense even if he couldn't read the organizational system. The walls were lined with the thin panels he'd seen in the corridors, but in here the writing on the panels was smaller, denser, personal. One wall was covered in what he initially took for star charts, and then looked more closely at and realized were settlement maps. Human settlements, ISA colony maps, updated and current, a dozen years of careful cartography covering 4 years of settlement expansion. Dozens of them, arranged chronologically, the older ones faded slightly at the edges, the newer ones sharply printed. He turned to look at her. "I have been following the settlement expansion," she said, and her voice had something careful in it, a precision that was also a kind of vulnerability, the voice of someone being accurate about something that costs accuracy. "For some years, I requested access to the ISA public archive and have been maintaining I do not have a good word for it, a study. It began as research relevant to diplomatic work. It became something else." "Why?" She looked at him levelly. "Because of you," she said. "Because I wondered where you were. Because you were 8 years old and your family was a settlement engineering family, and I knew that meant you would be somewhere in the network, but I did not know where, and I did not know how to look without." She paused. It seemed inadvisable at the time for a princess to be searching ISA personnel records for one specific human child. It did not seem like a thing I could explain to anyone, including myself. He looked at the maps again. Years of maintained interest. The careful abstraction of looking at the settlement network without looking at the specific name in it. "You could have looked me up," he said. "I was aware of that," she said. "I chose not to." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. The secondary eyelids closed briefly, opened again. "Because I was not certain what I would do with the information," she said. "And because finding you and then not doing anything would have been," she stopped again, the same place she'd stopped in the observatory. He waited this time without prompting. "Painful," she said at last, and the word came out with the care of something translated from a language that didn't have an equivalent, not just painful in the sense of discomfort, but painful in the sense of a thing that would leave a structural mark. He stood in the room full of maps and looked at the evidence of 21 years of quiet, indirect attention, the closest approach that was still technically a safe distance, and felt something shift in his chest. Not dramatically, not with fanfare. The way a building settles into its foundation when the load is finally balanced right, when the pylons have found the bedrock they'd been reaching for. A small, significant, permanent change in the structural state. What changed, he said. Why now? The council nomination, she said. But also, she paused. I am 32 years old. By Velhari reckoning, that is the beginning of formal maturity, the age at which decisions made previously are either honored or released. I have been carrying this for a long time. I needed to know. She looked at him. I needed to know if it was still real, if you were still real, if the person I remembered existed in the person who was actually there. And you laughed, she said very quietly, when I told you that you were average height. You laughed exactly the same way you did when you were 8 and She stopped. Her secondary eyelids closed briefly and reopened with a quality that he was beginning to read as the Velhari equivalent of collecting yourself. I had a memory of the sound. I did not know if the memory was accurate. It is. He crossed the room. Not with any particular plan, just the way you move towards something that needs to be closer. The way a structural assessment requires you to get your hands on the actual material rather than observing from a safe distance. He stopped an arm's length from her. Sariel, he said. Her full name in his mouth, he hadn't said it yet in either of their conversations. He watched her go still when he said it, the particular Velhari stillness that wasn't stillness but its opposite. Yes, she said. I didn't forget either, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Tell me something true, she said. What do you actually remember? He thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. The color of the sky, he said. The way you said recalibrating. The way you explained the vow like you needed me to understand it was serious, like you weren't going to say it again. He paused. The way you looked at the sky when you said it, like the sky was the important audience, not me. Her chin lifted slightly. The sky was a co-witness, she said. You were the subject. I know, he said. I figured that out eventually. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted, the way the air feels before a storm commits to arriving, that moment of charged stillness where everything has already decided what's going to happen and is simply waiting for the first move. The formal process, he said, the vow acknowledgement, what does it actually require? You said it could be honored or renegotiated or dissolved. What does honoring it look like? She met his eyes. A formal bonding declaration, she said, made between both parties, recorded and registered with the imperial court. A pause, followed by a traditional period of mutual familiarization, what you would call courtship, I believe, before any final contract is drawn. So it's not, we don't just sign something and that's it. No, she said. The vow creates an intention. What happens after is up to the parties. The formalization is not an arrival, it is a beginning. He nodded slowly, and you want to honor it. I want, she said carefully, to find out what it would be to honor it. I want to know you the way I knew you when we were children, which was, I believe, quite well despite the short time, but as the people we are now. I want, she stopped, tried again. I am not asking you to commit to a contract. I am asking you to commit to finding out whether the contract would be right. I am asking you to take the question seriously. He looked at her, the silver hair, the gold eyes, the careful precision of a woman who had spent 21 years maintaining maps of human settlements, and not looking up his name, because finding him and doing nothing would have been painful. That's a reasonable thing to ask, he said. Something moved in her expression, relief, he thought. though filtered through a face that had been practicing restraint for a long time, the relief of a person who had built a very careful structure and was watching it hold. "Yes," she said, "I thought so." The formal acknowledgement ceremony took place on the third day, in the observatory, at the bluing hour. He hadn't known they could manufacture the bluing hour on a ship. Sariel had explained it to him the night before, while they'd sat in her workspace. She'd moved some of the data slates off the secondary desk and set them on the floor, and he'd sat there in the cleared space, and she'd walked him through the Velhari constellation myths he'd partially learned at 8 and mostly forgotten. The light shift was a calibrated atmospheric effect, a specific spectrum manipulation that the ship's environmental systems could produce when instructed. It wasn't real sail asterisk, she'd said. Real asterisk sail required an atmosphere, a particular density of particulate matter in the air, a sun at the correct angle. But it was a reasonable argument to the stars, she'd said. The Velhari record-keepers accepted it as a sufficient approximation. He'd asked her, sufficient for what purpose? She'd said, sufficient to witness. The observatory filled with that nameless light as the ceremony began, the environmental systems having been instructed by someone, Sariel, he assumed, or someone acting on her direct instruction, to produce the approximation at the correct hour. The light settled over the transparent ceiling and diffused down through the room, tinting everything with that color that sat at the edge of human perception, that could only be seen in the peripheral register, where the eye caught what ordinary-looking couldn't. In that light her skin shifted. The deep navy moved through indigo into something closer to violet, and the internal light quality became more apparent, and the silver markings at her temples caught the spectrum and became briefly luminous, delicate and complex as frost on glass. She was, in the asterisk sail asterisk light, the most alien he'd seen her since he'd crossed the observatory and been close enough to notice the specific quality of her attention. He stood next to her and thought, this is what the 8-year-old had said asterisk yes to, and he'd been right to say it. A court official read the formal record, the date of the original vow, the location, settlement 4, Velhari designation Taukavan 17, the confirmed presence of natural asterisk sail asterisk as environmental witness, the names of both parties, the age and standing of both parties at the time, the fact that the vow had been made freely and without duress. It was a remarkably complete record for something that had been witnessed only by 2 children and the sky. The Velhari record-keepers, apparently, had been thorough even about things that happened among children on flagged ridges at dusk. When the official finished reading, she turned to both of them and asked, in the Velhari formal phrasing that Sariel had translated for him the night before, her voice careful and patient, "Do both parties acknowledge the vow as stated and remembered?" "Acknowledged," Sariel said. He said acknowledged. And then, because it was his turn for the next part, and because the official was looking at him with the careful blankness of professional ceremony, and because Sariel was looking straight ahead with the precision that meant she was not going to look at him until she was certain of what she'd see, he said the second part, the one Sariel hadn't told him he'd have to say, the one he'd added himself when she'd read him the script the night before and he'd sat with it and thought, there's something missing. "I'd like to honor it," he said, "if she'll let me." Sariel turned to look at him. The gold eyes, the secondary eyelids fully retracted. The manufactured asterisk sail pressing its nameless color into the air of the observatory, making everything sit at the edge of what the eye could catch. "Yes," she said. It wasn't the formal response. It was just the word, stripped of all its official register, said in the voice of a person who had been holding something for a very long time and had just stopped holding it alone. The court official made a careful note in her record and said the closing statement in Velhari that he didn't need translated. The ceremony was, formally, complete. What came after was not simple. He hadn't expected it to be. He was a human structural engineer who fixed broken habitats at the edges of the habitable zone, a person whose address changed every few months, whose professional worth was measured in the reliability of his assessments and the solidity of his repairs. She was a Velhari princess on the shortlist for a seat on the High Council, the diplomatic body that managed the most complex set of interspecies relations in this region of space, whose position required her to carry the interests of 4-star systems, and whose public record was examined under a standard of scrutiny that would make most humans uncomfortable. These were not naturally compatible lives. They both understood that from the first day of what the Velhari called the familiarization period, and what Calder privately called figuring out if this is actually possible or just beautiful. But the thing about structural problems, the thing he'd found consistently over a decade of working with broken things, was that the correct response to apparent incompatibility was not to walk away from the project. It was to understand the load properly. Most incompatibilities, when you looked at them honestly, were not incompatibilities of materials but of application. The wrong load in the wrong place, not the wrong materials for the structure. They talked. That was most of what the familiarization period was in those first weeks, talking. The way they'd talked on the ridge when they were children, but with 21 more years of life to bring to it. She told him about the council nomination, about what it would mean for Velhari human diplomatic relations if she were appointed, about the faction within her mother's court that was skeptical of her candidacy, precisely because of her documented interest in human settlements. A faction that had looked at 21 years of ISA settlement, maps in her workspace and drawn conclusions she found both accurate and irritating. He told her about the work, about a decade of fixing things in places that most people found difficult to live in, the particular human habit of building communities in conditions that were actively hostile to community building, and then being surprised when it worked. She listened to everything. He'd met good listeners before, his profession required it, the ability to hear not just what a systems operator said was wrong but what they weren't saying, the anxieties they were managing, the prior fixes they were embarrassed about. But he'd never met anyone who listened the way she did, not passively, not with the performance of attention, but with visible processing, her face moving subtly through what he was saying, the secondary eyelids occasionally flickering when something connected to something else. She asked questions that landed at the exact center of what he'd meant, sometimes before he'd finished articulating it to himself. He told her once that it was a little unnerving. She'd said, "You are an interesting person. I am interested." "You say that like it's obvious." "It is obvious," she'd said. "I do not understand why it would be otherwise." He thought about that for a long time afterward. The way she made interest seem like the natural and obvious response to a person worth paying attention to. The way she seemed genuinely puzzled by the idea that attention might be a limited resource you had to ration carefully. That interest was something you extended only provisionally and withdrew if the return wasn't sufficient. He wondered, occasionally, if that was a Velhari quality or a her quality. He came to believe it was both, but mostly her. Her mother, the Empress, was not famous for her uncalibrated interest in anyone. The opposition came formally at the 8-week mark. Sariel told him about it with the precise calm that he'd come to understand, meant she'd been sitting with the information long enough to decide how to hold it and how to present it. They were on the Sale Kavan *. He'd been offered a temporary consulting contract with the Velhari Diplomatic Corps, assessing settlement infrastructure near their shared borders, which had the dual virtue of being genuine work he was qualified to do, and of keeping him in a range that made the familiarization period practically possible. 3 members of the High Council Selection Committee had filed a formal objection to her nomination on the grounds of conflicted prior vow. The objection wasn't that she'd made the vow, childhood vows made in the presence of Sale were legally recognized and culturally respected under Velhari law, had been for generations. The objection was that a candidate with an acknowledged, actively honored vow to a human male, at a moment when Velhari human diplomatic negotiations were at a particularly contested inflection point, represented a structural conflict of interest that disqualified her from a seat on the body responsible for managing those negotiations. She read him the formal objection text. He listened to it without interrupting. "They're saying you can't be objective," he said when she'd finished. "Yes," she said. "Is there merit to it?" She looked at him steadily. "I am not objective about you," she said. "I have not been objective about you since I was 7 years old. That is accurate." She paused. "However, the objection conflates two different things. It assumes that my prior disposition toward humanity, toward humanity's worth, toward humanity's capacity for decency and loyalty, and the specific human quality of asterisk showing up for things that are difficult, constitutes a conflict of interest with my ability to negotiate fairly. I dispute that assumption. A diplomat who begins with a genuine understanding that the other party has value is not compromised. A diplomat who has been told that the other party has value and doesn't believe it, that is the compromised position." He looked at her for a moment. "That's a hell of an argument." "It is the true argument," she said. "I intend to make it." "What happens if the committee rules against you?" "I lose the nomination," she said. "The seat goes to a candidate whose relationship with human settlements and human capacity is limited to what they have read in official reports written by people who have also not spent significant time with actual humans." "And what happens to us, to the vow?" She met his eyes without hesitation. "Nothing," she said. "The vow is acknowledged and honored. What we are doing is not contingent on the council's decision. Those are separate structures." He nodded slowly. "You're sure about that?" "I have been sure about that since I was 7, she said, with the precise, accurate calm that still, after weeks of this, after daily conversation, after learning the texture of her thinking in a level of detail that the child on the ridge couldn't have imagined, still sometimes stopped him. "The council is a separate matter. I am not conducting this for strategic reasons." "I know," he said. "I wasn't asking because I doubted it. I was asking because I wanted to hear you say it." She looked at him. The secondary eyelids flickered once. "Ah," she said, "that is a human thing." "Probably," he said. "Sorry." "Don't apologize for it," she said. "It is actually useful information." "You needed to hear it said." She paused. "Then I will say it again. The vow is not contingent on the council. You are not contingent on the council. I am not doing this in order to appear to the committee as a candidate with a resolved diplomatic relationship. I am doing this because I made a vow at 7 years old, and I meant the intention of it. And I have been meaning it for 21 years. And I intend to continue meaning it regardless of what the committee decides about my suitability for a diplomatic seat." He looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said in a tone that meant, "This matter is settled." He did something he'd never done before. He asked to address the committee. It wasn't his world. It wasn't his process. He had no official standing in the Velhari High Council's nomination proceedings, no diplomatic status, no precedent he could cite that established a human structural engineer's right to speak in a formal Velhari selection review. He was not a diplomat, not a political figure, not a representative of any human government or institution with standing in Velhari courts. He was a man who fixed broken habitats. He asked anyway. Sariel looked at him when he told her. The gold eyes held his for a long moment without speaking, with that quality of assessment that meant she was not deciding whether to let him do it. It wasn't hers to permit or deny, but whether she understood why he wanted to. "You understand that they may refuse," she said. "Yes." "You understand that if they grant it, you will be speaking in front of the full selection committee, in a formal Velhari proceeding, and that everything you say will be entered into the permanent record." "Yes." "And you understand," she said carefully, "that I have not asked you to do this, that I have not suggested or implied that I need you to do this." "I know," he said. "I'm asking to do it because I want to, not because you need it, because I want to say something." She studied him. The secondary eyelids moved through several positions in the way they did when she was processing something complicated. "Why?" she said. He thought about it the way she deserved, honestly, with the same care she applied to difficult questions. About the ridge above Settlement 4 and the bluing hour and a 7-year-old who had made a vow with the sky as witness, and then spent 21 years carrying it in the only way available to her. Alone, indirectly, through maps she didn't look at for the name she wasn't looking for. "Because you spent 21 years carrying something you couldn't put down," he said, "and I'd like to help carry it for a while, and this is a way to do that." She was quiet for a long moment. The secondary eyelids drew fully back. "That," she said at last, very quietly, "is the most accurate thing you have ever said." They granted the request. The Velhari had a formal mechanism called *interested party testimony, a provision that allowed someone with a direct personal stake in a nomination's outcome to address the committee, provided they could establish their standing and that the testimony was relevant to the matter at issue. He qualified, barely, under the personal stake provision. He was, by the formal record, the other party in the acknowledged vow that had generated the objection. His testimony was relevant to the question of whether the vow constituted a genuine conflict of interest or something else. He suspected they also granted it, partly, out of the particular quality of Velhari curiosity, the genuine, careful interest they brought to things they hadn't encountered before. There was no record that anyone on the committee could find of a human being having addressed a Velhari High Council selection committee. They were curious about what it would be. He stood in the committee chamber, which was enormous and domed and lit by that same pale white gold that the Sail Kavan had used for the morning cycle. A whole planet of Velhari morning, translated into the architecture of an official room, and he looked at 7 Velhari counselors in full formal regalia, each one representing a different system or faction, each one watching him with that careful, assessing Velhari attention, and he thought, "This is the least prepared I have ever been for anything in my professional life." Then he thought, "She carried this for 21 years. I can say some true things in front of 7 people." He didn't give a speech. He wasn't a speech person. Speeches required you to know in advance what you were going to say, and to have arranged it into a form designed to move specific listeners toward a predetermined conclusion. What he did was what he did in engineering assessments. He described what was actually there. He told them about settlements, not the diplomatic narrative, not the political argument about human expansion or Velhari territory or the contested border zones. The actual settlements. The small communities built in hostile places by people who had very limited resources and very large intentions. The atmospheric processors they kept running with parts that weren't designed for each other. The habitats they reinforced with local materials that the engineering manuals didn't account for. The particular human quality of looking at a problem and saying, "This is a problem, therefore it can be solved, therefore I will solve it." He told them what a decade of living inside those communities and fixing the things that broke had taught him about the people who built them. And then he told them about the ridge. He told them about being 8 years old and a Velhari princess sitting down next to him on ground the geologists had flagged with orange tape, and explaining what the asterisk sail meant with the care of someone who understood that meaning needed to be communicated accurately or not at all. That a misunderstood vow was not a vow, that the words required the understanding of both parties to hold. He told them about the not quite skipping stones. He told them what she'd said when she explained why. "You are the first person who has listened to me without watching the door to see if someone important was coming." She was 7, he said. She'd read the papers about human settlements. She'd been in the linguistic immersion program. She knew the statistics and the trade agreements and the diplomatic history, and she had formed from those documents an accurate picture of what humans were capable of collectively. And then she sat on a ridge at the bluing hour with a human boy and paid attention to what was actually there, not the summary, not the representative case, not the example chosen to illustrate a point. The actual specific thing that was in front of her. He paused. That's not a conflict of interest. That is the exact capacity you want in a diplomat. The ability to look at the thing that is actually there and form an accurate picture of it, separate from whatever the documentation says about what it should be. He looked at the 7 counselors. I'm not objective about her either, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not standing here as an objective party. I'm standing here as the other party in a vow she made 21 years ago, and I want to say something about what that vow has meant and what it has not meant. He paused. It has not meant that she has been unable to think clearly about anything involving humanity. It has meant that she has been thinking clearly about humanity for 21 years, with the specific kind of clarity that comes from having looked at the actual thing rather than the report. If you want someone on the council who will understand the actual humans in the actual settlements, not the version of humans in the political briefings, but the people who are out there fixing atmospheric processors with parts that don't quite fit, you want someone who has been paying attention to the actual thing for 21 years. He stopped talking. The silence in the chamber had the quality of the bluing hour, that weighted, expectant quality of a moment being recorded. The committee ruled in her favor. He found out via official message, the same formal channel as the first one, and this time he didn't need to read it more than once. He read it standing in the corridor outside her workspace on the Sale Kavan asterisk, and then he knocked on the door. She opened it almost immediately, which meant she'd also received the message and had been waiting near the door, which was not the most precisely calibrated thing she'd ever done, and he found that enormously endearing. She'd seen the message. He could tell from her face, the secondary eyelids fully retracted, the expression stripped to something simpler and more immediate than her usual precision, like a room after unnecessary furniture has been removed. They approved the nomination, she said. I know, he said. I read the message. She looked at him. What you said to the committee was accurate, he said. A pause, then for the first time she laughed. It wasn't the way humans laughed, not quite the same architecture of sound and breath, a different arrangement of it, shorter and more contained, quickly caught behind her fingers. But it had the same essential quality. Unplanned, honest, the involuntary release of something that had built up pressure and found a moment of exit. She pressed her fingers against her mouth as if to recatch it, and her gold eyes were bright above her hand with something that wasn't entirely the reaction to what he'd said. It was wider than that, the brightness of a person who has been carrying something and put it down, and is only now feeling the difference in their own weight. He looked at her. That sound, he said. She met his eyes above her fingers. Yes, she said, muffled. Is that what it's like for you, he said, when I do that? She lowered her hand. Yes, she said, something in me recalibrates. He stepped into the doorway, close enough that the difference in their heights was apparent in the way it was most apparent, when standing still, looking at each other, not moving toward anything, just being in the same space. I want to keep doing this, he said. The familiarization period or whatever comes after it, I don't know what the shape of it looks like practically, given the logistics, but I want to figure out the logistics. I have been thinking about the logistics, she said. Of course you have. The council seat is based on the orbital station, she said. I will be traveling considerably in the role, but the station is a fixed address. ISA project assignments can be routed, she stopped. I looked into it. ISA settlement engineers can take postings near the Velhari border corridor. The transit time from the station to the nearest posting zone is manageable. I checked the schedules. He stared at her. You researched commute times. I researched several things, she said. I have been researching since before you arrived. I was reasonably confident you would want to continue. Reasonably confident, he said. The laugh, she said. When you read the summons, I was told by my assistant who was monitoring incoming comm confirmations for receipt timing that there was an audio pickup from the relay station where you were working. You laughed when you read the message. Her gold eyes held his, very steady. I was reasonably confident. He thought about this, about being heard, from orbit, laughing alone in a coolant relay corridor with coolant residue under his fingernails. About the precision of her attention applied in all directions simultaneously, gathering information the way light gathers, not choosing what to illuminate. Sariel, he said. Yes. I think the vow is still real, he said. She looked at him with the gold eyes that had first found him at 8 years old in the bluing hour light, serious, precise, and genuinely interested, measuring him not against what she'd been told to expect, but against what was actually there. Yes, she said. I know. On the evening before he was supposed to leave for his first ISA posting near the Velhari border corridor, the first in what would become a year of practical logistics, of two people learning the shape of a life conducted between two civilizations, of adjustments both large and small, they went to the observatory. It was not the bluing hour. It was the middle of the Velhari night cycle, the room lit only by what came through the transparent ceiling, stars, the soft distant glow of Drenaz's upper atmosphere, the scattered light of the system's outer belt moving in its slow and constant procession. No manufactured sail asterisk. Just the actual stars, which were old and abundant and indifferent, and had been witnessing things for a very long time. They stood together in the dark and looked up. Tell me their names, he said. She looked at him. The constellations, he said. The ones you started teaching me when I was 8, I forgot most of them. Not all of them. I still have the keeper, and the unfinished argument, but the third one is gone. A pause. Something moved in her expression, something that started near her mouth and spread outward, the kind of expression that was too large to contain in one feature and had to distribute itself across the whole face. The third constellation, she said. The one you couldn't translate exactly, he said. Something about the color your eye remembers after the light is gone. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned toward the ceiling, and he stood beside her, close enough that her silver hair occasionally drifted against his shoulder with that independent, deliberate quality of its movement. And she named them. Not the trade's standard approximations, but the Velhari names, spoken quietly in the original language that he couldn't speak, but was beginning to hear as a pattern, a grammar he could feel the edges of even when he couldn't read the interior. She had a speaking voice that was different from her formal voice, lower, less structured, moving through the Velhari phonemes with the ease of someone in their first language, their actual language, the one that worked in the part of the brain that thought before thinking. She translated as she went, and her translations were as careful as her first translations had been, that precision that was also a kind of generosity, the willingness to take the time to build a bridge between languages rather than just approximating. The keeper, the unfinished argument, the third one which she translated this time with a slight modification, the color the eye holds after the light has moved on, not gone, moved on. She said she'd translated it as gone when they were children because she hadn't had the trade standard word yet for the distinction. The distinction mattered. Gone implied absence, a finality. Moved on implied continuation. The light still existed, was still moving, had simply progressed past the point where that particular eye could catch it. He thought about photons that left dying stars and kept moving. The universe as a ledger, nothing truly erased, only made harder to read. That's the right translation, he said. Yes, she said, I know, I have thought about it many times. Above them, the stars held their positions. They were very old and they were very far away, and they had witnessed, over the course of their long and indifferent burning, an incalculable number of things. The formation of planets, the slow accumulation of chemistry into biology, the improbable emergence of creatures who looked up and asked what they were looking at, and then built ships to go find out, and discovered that the universe was full of other creatures who had done the same thing, and that this was both more complicated and more astonishing than any of them had anticipated. They had also witnessed, these old and patient stars, a child on a flagged ridge at dusk who had looked up at the nameless color and said something serious, and a boy who had said okay, and 21 years of a promise carried at a safe distance until the distance could be closed. Calder reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cool, longer than his, the obsidian nails catching the starlight and holding it for a moment before releasing it. She went still, that particular Velhari stillness that was everything turned inward, the maximum opening of attention applied to a single small point of contact. Then her fingers closed around his, slowly, the way something careful moves when it's being careful because it doesn't want to be careless with what it's holding. She didn't stop naming the stars. He stood beside her and listened, and above them the stars kept their long and patient witness, and somewhere in the Velhari record-keeping system, a vow made 21 years ago at the bluing hour above Settlement 4, made by a child who had understood that a permanent bond was the most accurate word for what she was feeling, witnessed by the light that promises, entered into the record and not let go, was logged as honored, acknowledged, and ongoing. As it was, as it had always been, from the moment she'd looked at the sky and said it, and the sky had remembered. The stars had never forgotten. Neither had they.